So as we saw earlier, ever since the origin of architecture, people were the center of the building, and humanistic culture was designed around the people, and they would be placed in the center, particularly in Renaissance architecture. While Wright changes things and he designs much more of dynamic open space. How did that happen? Where did it come from? And how he was able to manage it?
Okay, so let's see how that, let's call it decentering, is fundamental to the 20th century and how Wright participated in and led that phenomena. So one of our favorite slides in this course, once again.
Rotonda.
Right, Villa Rotonda by Palladio. And it places the human being in the center. And if we refer to the motto of the Renaissance borrowed from the Greek, man is the measure of all things. You can't measure unless you have a position to measure from. So this puts the human being at the center of the x, y, and z axes of the Cartesian coordinates, from which we can then measure, observe, and understand and control nature. And it's precisely to that that Wright is presenting an alternative. Now, this idea carries on. Here we are, the Villa Rotonda. Here in 1941, this is 6 years after Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, National Gallery in Washington, D.C., we're still building that building. So it took a while for it to spread, but here, if we contrast, of course, they're totally different programs, but if we contrast the National Gallery to the Roby House, in the center of the National Gallery is a human being. In the center of the Roby House is a chimney core and stair. In other words, we are pushed out of the center to meander around it and even interpenetrating between inside and outside, along with the rest of nature. So Wright is, in effect, rejecting the humanist point of view that human beings stand apart from, above, understand, and control nature, to say human beings are an integral part of nature. So it's a totally different position about what a human being is, our relationship to nature. And it is a position he manifests in his architecture. So we can take architecture as philosophy stated by its buildings.
And interestingly, in the classical architecture, everything is symmetrical, right? Like there are two axes of symmetry, and everything had to obey to that symmetry.
We're symmetrical.
There is in Wright only apparently, only on the outside, and not even. No, if you look in detail, yes, like the two sides of the human body are not quite symmetrical, and they're not symmetrical in the inside at all. So there's nothing symmetrical about Frank Lloyd Wright. No, and maybe that has to do with the idea of kind of the house growing from the inside out. The house starts from the center, starts from the human movement and the idea of inhabiting that space, and then he grows it towards the outside, and that's how we get the asymmetry of the outside.
So that's one of the definitions of organic architecture, that it grows from the inside out rather than putting a suit of clothes on over it. So let's look at how at this idea. Key to this is the open plan, and we've described the open plan before, but the space flows from one room to another. And there's no, a lot of the rooms do not have a corner, so that the corner is what makes a box. And Wright describes his desire to destroy the box. And so we have the open plan, space flowing from one room to another, indicative of a change in the family. So in, 19th century Victorian family, after dinner, the father goes to the smoking room, the mother goes to the sewing room, the children go to the nursery. And in the 20th century, let's jump up at today, we have All in the Family, and it's just a zoo. I mean, it's like, wait a minute, who are these people? What are their relationships? And the point is, rather than each having a defined box, they're all just flowing around in these different roles. So Wright is engaging this. So this is part of a larger phenomena. When Wright was growing up, the Milky Way was the entire universe. In the 1920s, Hubble discovered there were billions and billions of other galaxies. We thought, you know, there was our galaxy, that was it. And now there are countless billions of them. When Wright was growing up, Newtonian's laws of fixed space and time, absolute space and time, held. 1905 and 1915, Einstein published Special and General Relativity that put space and time in flux, very much like Wright's flux. When Wright was growing up, we still had perspective. So even though this is an impressionist painting by Degas, very clear established perspective. 1900s, we get Cubism with the subject shattered and the observer in motion around it. When Wright was growing up, novels were chronological. Then we get the novels of Proust, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, where they're organized by the stream of consciousness of a person rather than objective outside reality. When Wright was growing up, humans were the favored children of the Creator, and with Darwin, humans were on their own just one more animal with our Darwinian evolution. And when Wright was growing up, the small farm was a place of both production and consumption. Wright grew up on a small farm. By the early 20th century, the typically father went off to the factory or office to be the breadwinner, and the home was only for consumption. So whereas in a small farm, you grew your food, you cooked it, and you ate it, you went to the work shed, you made a chair, and then you sat on it. Now you only consume. And that's the American suburban home, which Wright played a fundamental part in creating. When Wright was growing up, there were still European empires that saw themselves as descendants of Rome. After the First World War, these had all fallen apart and disintegrated, and Wright helped end their architecture, their neoclassical architecture. So we've seen this slide before, but the span of Wright's life, when he was born in 1867, was 2 years after the end of the Civil War. When he died in 1959, it was only 2 years later that President John F. Kennedy announced that we would be going to the moon. So that's this incredible span from his first house on his own that had stables in the back to one of his late projects, a mile-high building with atomic-powered elevators. So, question for our students today is, how do we orient ourselves today? So we're talking about Wright, we're talking about 50 to 100 years ago. What are we doing today? So that's something to think about.